As the moderate technocracy collapses and Trump continues to buffoon his way around the wreckage, a podcast comes around to document it all. This is Whispers of a Dark Future, and welcome to the year of Kamala Harris.
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree?
Should we say who we are and all that stuff?
I am the being, otherwise known as Post Comprehension, and you are...
I am Piper Tompkins.
Interesting. Your parents named you I Am and then the actual name. That's very interesting.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
All right. So what do we want to talk about today?
Yeah, so basically we're going to be going over how Trump has attempted to transform the United States into an illiberal democracy in his second term. We're mainly going to be focusing on his second term because in his first term, he didn't do a whole lot. The best he sort of did was to stack the Supreme Court in his favor. And, that's something that basically any president can do. It's not really something that's prohibited by the rules of liberal democracy. So we're going to be largely focusing on his second term, which is where he's sort of deployed roughly the plan outlined by Project 2025 to transform U.S. democracy into an illiberal conservative democracy. Maybe we should start with some definitions of terms. Do you maybe want to define illiberalism, illiberal democracy, liberal democracy, that kind of stuff?
Oh, geez, off the cuff. Okay.
Well, you can. You can pull up stuff to read if you want.
Yeah. So, illiberalism usually just means opposition to liberalism and liberal values. There's an illiberalism on the left. There's an illiberalism on the right. And so, with this meaning in mind, in fact, it's argued that anarchists like ourselves would be illiberal, of course, on the illiberal left. What's usually referred to when we talk about Trump and illiberalism, more specifically in the context of liberal democracy, it refers to the undermining of liberal institutions that prop up a functioning, as liberals argue, their version of a functioning democracy, which is separation of powers. The elections have to be free and fair and competitive, things like that. And so an illiberal democracy will use the infrastructure of constitutional democracy from within to dismantle, corrupt, and abuse its own limitations toward making sure, basically turning it into an autocracy from the inside out while maintaining the constitutional and democratic framework. So it's an interesting form of authoritarianism because it, instead of making this bid to completely transform it into either, say, a military regime or one-party state or an anti-systemic project, illiberal democracies are more just content with a lot of things that other authoritarians are not content with. And so they'll keep the proceduralism, they'll keep the Constitution, but they'll constantly abuse these things, right? So like in Russia, there's no question of who's going to get elected. It's always Putin, but there's always an election. In fact, the recent changes to the Russian Constitution a few years back put in term limits, meaning Putin can't be the Russian president beyond the mid-2030s. And so look at America. It's interesting because during January 6th protests and everything, and Trump attempting to overturn the election, this whole attempt to put in fake electors, to effectively attempt a self-coup, was all in the name of getting another term. Other authoritarians, usually when they're doing a self-coup, they're just trying to change the system into being a president permanently through the Constitution or some other mechanisms of military control. With Trump, a lot of that effort was off the back of democratic legitimacy, right? Like, oh, I need this second term because that's what the people want, and that's what democracy wants, and that's what the Constitution wants. Whereas usually in other cases with self-coups, the argument is we need to get rid of the system because the people need a whole new system, or they need something more, or I need to be more in power because the people are corrupt, or things like that. And of course, it's interesting because all of the reason illiberal Democrats, and more specific, because the illiberal democracy again is really just, like I said, this just sort of corrupting autocratic power that's inside of a constitutional democratic infrastructure. It's not necessarily right-wing populist. I mean, there are academics who will argue that the Chinese communist state is technically an illiberal democracy because the way they do democracy is functionally different. So more specifically, the kind of ideology that's wrapped around this system or the structure of a liberal democracy that Trump, Modi, Erdogan, and Orban are bringing to the table is what academics will call right-wing populism. And the goal of right-wing populism isn't just to illiberalize democracy, but also to transform it into an ethnocracy where the constitutional democracy only represents a specific homogenous ethnos. So hopefully that was a decent explanation as to what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. So, we should maybe turn our attention to some of the ways in which Trump in his second term has tried to install illiberal democracy in the United States. And then maybe we can draw out some comparisons to Hungary, maybe Russia. But so the sort of ways in which Trump has attempted to install liberal democracy in the United States sort of go back a bit to the period in between his two terms. So when he stacked the Supreme Court and there were all kinds of legal issues that he faced for his sort of illiberal and corrupt actions, in reviewing those some of those legal issues, the Supreme Court essentially gave the President of the United States the ability to not be to be immune from prosecution in cases where the president's actions are official sort of actions of the office of president. Basically, that since that's so vague in terms of the court's ruling, basically says that Donald Trump, it can be interpreted at least to say that Donald Trump can basically do whatever he wants in office as long as it's deemed an official act as president. And of course, we got that sort of result by Trump stacking the Supreme Court. Also, in between terms, you had the development of Project 2025. It was a document, a political program for Donald Trump, written by the Heritage Foundation. Trump himself tried to distance himself from the document, but he's largely sort of implemented it in his second term. Basically, the whole point of Project 2025 is for Trump to do a sort of purge of the federal bureaucracy on essentially an ideological basis rather than on the basis of the sort of competence and qualifications of officials. So, get rid of people who are opposed to him in the federal bureaucracy, get rid of whole agencies that are opposed to him in the federal bureaucracy that don't align with conservative values, get rid of programs like DEI, which don't align with conservative values, try to bring the hammer down on federal institutions and institutions that get federal funding, like universities, to be in line ideologically with sort of American right wing, American liberal conservatism. And so that's sort of what's behind Trump's massive gutting of all these federal agencies that he's been carrying out, and these orders that he's putting on universities who get federal funding to, basically police anti-Israel sentiment on campus and get rid of DEI and so forth. DEI, if you don't know, is just diversity, equity, inclusion. Basically, it's essentially policies directed at diversifying the personnel staff at institutions with a view toward equality for groups that have been marginalized from those institutions. Conservatives have this narrative that it's kind of like, a woke ideological agenda that makes institutions less efficient. It actually makes them more efficient. It actually, when corporations institute DEI measures, it actually makes them more profitable. But, these people don't really, their ideology isn't consonant with the realities of the world.
Yeah. It's sort of a constraining of like the internet, like, because a lot of what right populism is doing is it's complaining about like elitism, specifically the elitism of like international market forces that are undermining like the homogenous values. And so in America, it's like, oh, DEI is this pernicious foreign elite funded ideological program to disassemble America from the inside out by removing like all the values that put people to believe in the American state, and as well as put in quote unquote undesirables into position of governance. And by firing all these people and doing away with DEI, we can reassert cultural and value hegemony back. And what this does at the same time is it effectively, all these institutions that are being removed, having people being removed from them, allows Trump to gain more power because he can remove whoever he wants under the excuse of DI ideology and put in someone more favorable.
Right. Yeah. And there's a sort of interesting dimension to Trump's attempt at illiberalism with Elon Musk. He has promoted Elon Musk, as we all know, to head the Department of Government Efficiency. Department of Government Efficiency.
It's funny because it's not really a department. It's like an advisory body.
Yeah, I'm just talking about like the name of the thing.
Yeah, but I think it's funny. Yeah, right. But it's funny.
That's what it stands for, right? I'm getting
right.
It. Yeah,
yes, okay. Department. It's a faux department because it's if I remember correctly. I think it's like an advisory body. And it has this like what I think is great about Doge, not great like actual great, but like sort of funny, is that Doge functions as this ambiguous sort of body that can be used for all sorts of things, because since it's not actually technically a department in the government, it's not upheld to forces within the government that would obstruct what Trump is trying to do. And so it both acts as this nebulous body, but also a body that's incredibly close to the president. So then Musk can be put into it and do extensive amounts of damage without having to be put to any sort of pressure or held to any standard that any actual department of government would be.
Right. So it's an interesting sort of double-edged sword because, from Trump's point of view, it's a mechanism for him to appoint a sort of lackey of his, Elon Musk, regardless of whether, sort of without Musk actually being sort of elected by the American people. Although, there's a way in which some of that is spin, because a lot of the officials in a liberal democracy like the United States are actually just appointed rather than elected. That is something that maybe I think liberal commentators will sort of brush by. But
I mean, those unelected bodies function as like technocratic management to make sure that people are following the line, and they believe they either believe in the policies sold by politicians or are so sort of alienated from everything that they've left, like they've just sort of disassociated from politics entirely, right?
Yeah, right.
And because a huge part of how liberal democracy works is manufacturing consent, engineering policies, constraining what parties are allowed to do and say, and making sure when people go to the voting booth, they're not putting in illiberals, which it's a testament to the system's crumbling and withering that all these illiberals have gotten into power when they weren't supposed to by the metrics of the system.
Right. And so from Trump's point of view, the illiberal dimension of it is, Elon Musk is supposed to go after anybody that sort of would use government authority to oppose what Trump is doing. From Elon Musk's perspective, he buys into the illiberal conservative ideology, of course, the right-wing populism. But for him, it also has this added personal benefit where he gets to go after any agency of the government that would regulate his businesses in a way he doesn't like. For instance, the FAA, which he has recently done. he is so it has this sort of double-edged sword quality where, on the one side it's being used purely for the business advantage of Elon Musk, a sort of tech bro capitalist, and on the other side Trump is using it for his sort of a liberal conservative agenda. And there's a way in which those things can come into conflict, as we've seen with Trump's sort of unilateral tariffing that was sort of economically boneheaded and, sort of just a way for Trump to bully other nations into getting what he wants and to act in accordance with his sort of America First ideology that his supporters subscribe to. Elon Musk has actually found that very objectionable. Now, interestingly, without criticizing Trump himself, he's gone after those policies rather viciously, at least, in terms of rhetoric, seeing them as, saying that they're disastrous, going after a Trump official and insulting him personally, all the while being careful not to attack Trump directly. So there's that kind of, conflict of interest. And it's a sort of way in which you can see how right-wing populism, conservative right-wing populism of this kind is sort of in tension with itself, in that it has to rely on the democratic capitalist state in order to achieve its goals. But the democratic capitalist state will be tied to business interests that will oftentimes conflict with sort of conservative nationalist values. And so there's that sort of internal tension. There's also the ethnocratic dimension as being spoken about to be discussed. Trump is currently trying his best to get birthright citizenship revoked in the United States. He has been deporting droves of people on planes to basically an infamous El Salvadorian detention center known for its human rights abuses.
Yeah.
And he's done that without sort of giving those people due process, labeling them as members of MS-13, and doing so on the basis of relatively superficial tattoo identification. And that led to this famous case with Abrego Garcia, who is actually himself fleeing gang violence in El Salvador, and has been sent off to that infamous detention center. And the Trump administration, despite legal orders from both lower judges and the Supreme Court to in some way effectuate his return to the United States, or facilitate, in the Supreme Court's words, the Trump administration is sort of dancing around it, despite the fact that they've admitted it's administrative error. And, and there you can sort of see how the illiberalism and the ethnocracy go together. It's not only a denial of the civil rights that a liberal democracy promises, and the due process that a liberal democracy promises to citizens and prospective citizens, but it's done in line with this sort of xenophobic ideology that sees South Americans as not genuine members of the American national community. Did you have something to say, Beef?
Well, it's interesting because I think it's interesting because some people have compared this to Guantanamo Bay under the Bush and Obama administrations, and some people have tried to sort of undermine Trump as a threat to liberal democracy by saying, well, look, you have the Bush administration and the Obama administration who would, take quote unquote suspected terrorists and put them through torture and then throw them in Guantanamo Bay, a territory outside of the U.S., so they could do whatever they want. I think what's interesting to note is, liberal democracy is able to do a number of horrible things, but I think what's interesting about comparing these two things is with Guantanamo Bay, it was all within the infrastructure of liberal democracy. It was all under the notion of maintaining it against a threat and enshrining the two-party system and enshrining the technocratic bodies that supervise over elections. the enactment of the Patriot Act helped to help beef up surveillance and everything.
Right.
So I think Guantanamo is both a good and bad thing to compare, because it shows that liberal democracy is capable of doing very similarly bad things that illiberals will do, but for very different reasons. Whereas with Trump and the El Salvadoran prison, the purpose of this is not merely to beef up liberal democracy or the liberal state and its elites. Actually, it's sort of running counter to their desires. Hence why they're an uproar about it, right?
Right, yeah. And so maybe now we should move into comparisons to the process of liberalization. Let's start with Hungary. Maybe we can talk about Russia a little, although we'll talk about maybe some of the ways in which Russia isn't a great comparison. But let's start with Hungary. What would you say are the most salient comparisons between the process of liberalization in Hungary, which is now complete under Viktor Orban and Fidesz, and the processes of illiberalization in the United States under Trump, which is not yet complete?
I think the similarities that a lot of people have some people have brought up is Hungary's dismantlement of the free press and free academy system, so the free education system. Often the big hallmark of liberal democracies is the free education, not just free education, but a high quality of that free education, so that liberal academics can go in there and pursue both legitimate research and scientific endeavors while also engaging in propagandic things as well, you know. And by going in and removing these things and changing free education, you're helping to really get at the source of a lot of the training for a lot of liberal elites and for propaganda formation, as well as just, like I said, good actual research that if you take away the propaganda is still valuable research for the humanities and everything that's being ripped away. So not only are we losing liberal propaganda, which we would think is a good thing, we're also losing potentially valuable sociological research, for example, which is going to be viewed as antithetical to the homogenic values of illiberal conservatism and everything with it.
Right.
And so Trump is attacking large American institutional universities like Harvard, which is trying to fight back, and Orban, took those institutions out to solidify his power. And he turned the university system from a liberal-dominated free education to a conservative one, where he can not only insulate his own power, but have another body by which to reinforce it.
Right. I think there's also, Trump. Some of the more outlandish sort of Trump remarks are, okay, while he was on the campaign trail talking about legal persecution for people who said negative things about him. And during this term, he has said things like, oh, I consider CNN and MSNBC, basically the liberal media, as illegal. He's barred the AP press from reporting at the White House. And so, the attacking of the sort of oppositional press is sort of reminiscent of how Orban has used legislation against foreign enemies to crack down on civil society organizations in Hungary, which are antithetical to his ideology and his regime. Maybe we should then talk about some of the similarities and differences with Russia. Do you have anything interesting to say on that point?
Yeah, I think Hungary is a far more comparable example, although there are obvious differences. Russia is interesting to compare because when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia finally got democracy, it started out as essentially a liberal autocracy, an authoritarian liberal regime, wherein Boris Yeltsin had gotten into power and liberalized economically, allowed some civil liberties, but at the same time held a lot of autocratic consolidation to make sure that when elections happened, he would get voted in, and there wasn't much obstruction to his own personal power. About his or more than being about his removal. So
it should probably be put in the framework of what Gorbachev was doing. So what Gorbachev was doing was, in the Soviet Union, was he was influenced by the intellectuals of the Prague Spring, who wanted to liberalize both economically and politically the Soviet quote unquote socialist system. And so he, at a very late point in the Soviet Union's existence, when a lot of the rot had set in, a lot of the economic mismanagement, a lot of the weariness of the population for dealing with the authoritarianism. After 1956 and 1953, in which uprisings in the non-Russian republics were suppressed, Gorbachev had kind of embarked on this program of liberalizing Soviet socialism. And to this end, he instituted the programs of Glasnost and Perestroika for economic and political liberalization. And the effect of it was contrary to Gorbachev's aims of liberalizing Soviet socialism. In fact, it was to accelerate the process of the collapse of Soviet socialism. And so Soviet regime collapses, and Boris Yeltsin comes in with an even more sort of radical agenda of basically forcing through the liberalization of Russia. He attacks the parliament with the military. And so he sort of tries to ramrod in an authoritarian fashion the liberalization of Russia. Putin ends up becoming his successor, and Putin, sort of in the wake of the economic turmoil that the rapid-paced privatization and market reforms that were implemented in the Soviet Union at the behest of the West caused, was able to sort of sell the population this sort of authoritarian provision of security, and sort of, convey to them this message that, rectifying the economic situation is more important than political liberalism. And so what you get eventually is Putin developing these sophisticated mechanisms of propaganda to divide and conquer the opposition, basically carrying out fraudulent elections that keep him in power. And he ultimately ends up adopting this sort of Russian conservatism that sees the rest of the world, particularly the liberal West, as a sort of corrupting cosmopolitan progressive force against traditional Russian values and the traditional Russian nation. And the big difference here is that whereas Hungary had to go through a process of liberalization, the process of liberalization in Russia wasn't really a process of a liberalization, because Russia was never really a liberal democracy. Even under Yeltsin, as you said, it's a sort of authoritarian liberal regime. Before that, in the Soviet Union, it was a communist party dictatorship. And then before that, it was the Tsarist Empire. And in the Tsarist Empire, there was this big sort of ultimately unsuccessful struggle to adopt Western liberal democracy. Even a constitutional monarchy is something that liberal intellectuals were unable to achieve in Tsarist Russia. So there didn't really have to be this process of a liberalization. All that really happened is Putin sort of took advantage of the social turmoil to continue the process of authoritarian government. The degree to which there was a liberalization was that for a brief period, you had an authoritarian liberal regime rather than a liberal democracy, and Putin basically just annexed liberalism and created the liberal democracy.
Right, because there's already that infrastructure of autocracy. There's already this infrastructure of a faux procedural democracy. It's all right there anyways. And so all the autocrat has to do is just shift gears. And he doesn't have to go in and destroy any of the You didn't have to go in and destroy this robust procedural competitiveness because that was never there to begin with. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, maybe we should now go on to talking about the obstacles that Trump still faces to completing his program of illiberalization. What would you say are the main obstacles there?
There's still enough judicial bodies in the way of him. I think when you have liberal democracy and especially the infrastructure of what we would call moderate technocracy, a lot of the backbone of carrying out law and constitutional procedure and the weight of that was put more on to courts and juries, and so uh, academics will actually call this a juristocracy, funnily enough. But there's still a lot of those judicial institutions that already have the weight of having to carry out the system that are going to still be in his way. Even the Supreme Court he stacked is in his own way.
Right. They, in fact, ruled that the administration needed to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia. And of course, his officials tried to spin that, to make it seem as if the Supreme Court wasn't sort of throwing an obstacle in his way. I mean, I largely agree with what you've said there. I think, basically, I mean, I think one way in which to see how liberal democratic institutions in the United States are still able to put up some resistance to Trump is that, you can compare Trump's ongoing attempt to revoke birthright citizenship with what just happened in Hungary, where Orban has backed this constitutional change to basically make LGBT public gatherings illegal and to recognize only two genders. This was something that, basically the illiberal conservatives in Hungary were, this was effectively a change to the constitution of Hungary that illiberal conservatives were able to push through. Whereas to revoke birthright citizenship, Trump is still, sort of tumbling through this sort of, long, bureaucratic legal process. So, maybe now it would be good to talk about the possibilities for the resistance to liberal conservatism in the United States, not the resistance that liberal institutions put up, but the resistance that social movements can put up.
Right, because if this was a liberal podcast, we would say, well, we got the midterms, right? Yeah, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter all the things that Trump does now. If we get out the vote and we beat him in the midterms, we can reverse all of this.
Right. It's interesting because I did a video recently, I did a video during the, in the run up to the election. Don't
worry, 6 months is recent for you. So
yeah, well, that's true. So unfortunately, in October, where I sort of outlined the sort of anarchist position against voting. Even the liberal democratic state exists to prop up the power of the capitalist ruling class and to subordinate the working class and various minority groups in society. And so ultimately, there's not much point in voting for an anarchist. An anarchist, seeing that the existing system exists to perpetuate the social structures and social relations that anarchists seek to eliminate. Voting for someone, even as a lesser evil, is a complete sort of crapshoot. And so, what anarchists advocate instead is direct action by oppressed people to fight back against their oppression themselves, rather than voting for somebody that they hope will stop it. And, there was someone left a comment on that video after Trump had gotten elected, and,
Surely this
things that
comment will be well thought out, and
yeah, well,
rethink a few things.
yeah, right. Well, the comment was something like, "This video aged like milk." And I responded with, "Yeah, nothing that's happened since has changed my mind." The fact is that the Democratic Party were calling Trump a fascist. They were saying that this was a struggle for democracy. And when their strategy of trying to promote centrist liberalism against right-wing populist liberal conservatism failed, like, many of us should have known that it was going to fail, because, people just sort of endured sort of this stagnation decline under Biden, cost of living going up, nothing being done about the war in Gaza or the environmental crisis. Of course, they were going to find those who did vote, and there was a record. There was a sort of marked lack of turnout this time. Those who did vote either weren't going to vote for Kamala or they were going to vote for Trump. So that shouldn't have been a surprise. This is the supposed lesser evil that I, in a non-swing state that's blue anyway, and that remained blue, was supposed to vote for. I mean, it's just sort of ridiculous. Well, this is as much a result of the failure of the liberal center to hold off the far right, as it was, the far right coming in and exercising the autonomy that it has to change things in the direction that it wants to change them. So why should I, kowtow to this ineffective opposition that is against my values anyway?
Well, the real baffling thing wasn't just they were positioning themselves as the centrist liberal choice. The baffling thing was they were trying to present themselves as also the liberal conservative choice, right? Like Kamala was saying, I'm going to be not just a centrist liberal president, I'm also going to be a moderate conservative president. It's like, what?
Right, yeah. Yeah, moderate conservative. Well, moderate conservatism as the lesser evil to liberal conservatism, I'm afraid, is a really hard sell, and it should be. I mean, it's not, like, why is, Liz Cheney really? Like,
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because illiberal conservatives will basically use the state to crush queer people, while more liberal moderates may do that, but what they're more comfortable with is having state governments do that instead, or private entities do that.
Yeah. Right. And so, it's like sort of ridiculous. So this sort of highlights a point that I made in a recent piece that I wrote for Red and Black Anarchists, which is that, okay, there's been this, fairly large protest movement against Trump. There's been direct action against Elon Musk's companies, vandalism, so forth. And there's been a hands-off protest across the United States, and even actually internationally. And the direction those protests need to go is in a direction that does not try to preserve liberal democracy against illiberalism. It is a direction that needs to see that illiberal conservatism and liberal democracy are both the tools of inequality, of oppression, of the unfreedom of human beings. And so, people shouldn't be holding up signs saying, give us our democracy back. They should be demanding the dissolution of the state, the dissolution of the capitalist system.
All right. Well, with that, do we want to close things out with anything positive, more negative? How do we want to close things out for the first episode?
Well, I think we should close things out with some self-promotion. So the both of us have YouTube channels. Mine is Piper Tompkins. His is Post Comprehension. And we will also be setting up a Patreon for this channel. If you wish to financially support us, we would be very grateful for that. And
Be grateful for the both of us.
yeah. If he's not grateful, I'll be grateful for him. So, yeah, that was the first episode of the podcast. We're hoping to do it bi-weekly.
Yeah,
Bisexual
weekly.
Yeah, bisexual weekly, exactly. And yeah, any closing remarks?
Potato,
I agree.
chicken, and couch.
Chicken and couch. Damn. Anyway, see you guys later.
Here's the Coco Bella thing you give me.